The Mavic Air 2 is a seriously impressive piece of tech capable of delivering some amazing cinematic results, and it's probably one of my favorite drones to use. So in today's video, I'll walk you through all the settings which I use on a regular basis when shooting with the Mavic Air 2, so you'll also be able to capture footage like this one. Before I start with the settings, I want to quickly say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions come together to take the next step in their creative journey, with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. Members get unlimited access to thousands of classes with hands-on projects and feedback from a community of millions. Most classes are under 60 minutes with short lessons to fit any schedule. In an effort to improve my own photography and mostly my Instagram feed, I took a class recently by Marte Forsberg. It's called Lifestyle Photography. This class is pretty short, but it teaches you how to get the most out of your location, how to maximize the usage of the light that you have around you, and pretty much how to create better photos. So I find it really inspiring how quickly you can change the look of your images before even taking the shot by simply tweaking a couple of little things that normally you don't think about. So the first 1,000 of my subscribers who click the link in the description are going to get 2 months free of Skillshare Premium, so you can start exploring your creativity today. Now, let's start with the settings themselves. First, I want to talk about frame rates and resolution. For my usage, I always use the highest resolution possible, which is 4K, and normally I use 30 frames per second as my frame rate. If I, however, plan to shoot something which I plan to slow down afterwards in post, I am going to switch to 4K 60 frames per second. The Mavic Air 2 is amazing in that regard because it gives you 4K 60 and it gives you a peace of mind that whatever you're shooting, you will be able to slow down and get some really nice results by also having a really nice bitrate to work with, so you don't have to worry that your footage will look blurry or choppy or bad. In general. So for the most part, I would say 95% of the time I'm using 4K 30 frames per second. For ISO, I'm always choosing the lowest ISO possible. If I'm shooting on a nice, sunny, bright day, the ISO is always 100. However, don't feel scared to bump up the ISO to 200 or even 400 during the day. See this shot, for example, it was taken with ISO of 200. It was because I had an ND filter on and it was too dark for this particular angle. But I didn't have the time to get the drone back to me to remove the filter and get back to this location. I just had to bump up the ISO a little bit and make it a good exposure altogether. So I really don't think it's such a big deal to bump up the ISO a little bit on some of your shots. If you need a good exposure, just make sure you don't go too high so you don't have any noise in your footage. As for my shutter speed, I always try to keep it double my frame rate. So if I'm shooting in 4K 30, my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. However, this is also a rule that can be broken. It's not such a big deal if you change your shutter speed a little bit so you can compensate for extra light that you have, for example. So if you're shooting in a very sunny situation, your shutter speed is double your frame rate, you have an ND filter, and still it's too bright, you can go to a shutter speed that is a bit higher, so maybe 1/100th of a second or 1/120 of a second. Something like that is also fine. It's not a huge deal. It's not something that everyone will notice straight away when watching your video. Just keep in mind that it makes your motion blur a bit less, so it looks a little bit less natural, but it's not going to damage your footage and make it unwatchable. So it's not a huge deal if sometimes you need to play with your shutter speed and adjust it accordingly to the light. Really like this magnetic case. And here I have some filters from PGY Tech. I also have some Polar Pro filters for the Mavic Air 2, and generally I use a lot of ND filters. I have a large selection of ND filters from Freewell, PGY Tech and Polar Pro. They're all for the Mavic Air 2, and I highly recommend you to get some filters for your Mavic Air 2 if you plan to record cinematic footage. ND filters are extremely important to block a lot of the light so you can reduce that shutter speed and have a natural motion blur in your footage. I tend to use the Polar Pro variable ND filters the most, simply because they're very convenient. You have a little ring that you can rotate to adjust the strength of the ND filter. However, feel free to purchase any ND filters from Freewell, PGY Tech or Polar Pro. They're all great. I've tested them all and I can recommend them very highly. Before I start flying, I always do a very quick safety check, just making sure my return to home altitude is set to 50 meters and not to 30, which is the default one. I set my maximum flight distance and I set my maximum height distance as well, just to make sure that everything is set according to the location where I'm flying and according to the rules at that specific place. And then I'm good to go and start flying. An important setting which I always turn on all of my drones which support this feature is to allow the gimbal to rotate another 30 degrees upwards. This feature is really important for me because it basically gives your drone more movement. And especially for those reveal type of shots, you really need that extra movement so you can focus straight on that object which is in the upper area of your shot. As for my other video settings, I choose MP4 as my format. I shoot everything in D-Cine-like color profile, and I shoot everything in H.265 codec. Shooting in D-Cine-like for me makes the biggest difference because that is what gives you the chance to really tweak your footage afterwards in post and retain all of that different data about the highlights, the midtones and the shadows in your footage. If you decide to shoot in normal, that's also fine, but keep in mind that all of that information is going to be baked in your file, and it's a lot harder to change any colors, play with the shadows, highlights and midtones. And if you really want to color grade your footage, D-Cine-like is the only way to go. For the rest of my video settings, I always set my histogram to on so I can see it on my screen. I have my overexposure zebra warning on, so in case anything is overexposed, it's very easy for you to see and correct that with the right settings so you don't shoot overexposed footage. I set my grid lines to on so I can properly frame my shots and use the rule of thirds in case I need it. I also set the center point to on, so in case I'm doing a manual orbit around an object, I can keep it straight in the middle, and that makes it very easy for me to know which point in the screen is the middle. For the white balance, I have a little trick which I use on a regular basis. I set the drone up in the sky and I point it towards the general area where I plan to shoot. Then what I do is I set it to auto, so it takes the right white balance at this specific spot, and then I press the manual white balance button. This takes the automatic white balance which the drone has selected and it sets it to manual. It takes the same value, so it's not going to change automatically afterwards, and it sets it to that specific amount. And finally, of course, in order to take cinematic footage with the Mavic Air 2, you need to fly smoothly. And how do you do that? Of course, that takes a lot of practice, but I always advise anyone asking to fly slow and as smoothly as possible, because afterwards in post you can always speed up your footage, you can speed ramp it, but you cannot make it smoother if it's not too smooth. And to achieve that buttery smooth cinematic footage, you need to be gentle with the sticks and you need to be slow and smooth and precise. Of course, that takes some practice, so don't get discouraged if you don't get those smooth shots on your first couple of tries. Keep practicing and you'll get there. But that's pretty much it. Those are the things which I use on the Mavic Air 2. Those are the settings which I use, and this is how I'm able to create some cinematic shots with that drone. So ever since I got the Mavic Air 2, I've been flying with it a lot and I've been pretty impressed by it. But stay tuned for my full video review, the long-term review of the Mavic Air 2, which hopefully should be up on the channel in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, and if you want to make sure you'll be the first to see it, hit that subscribe button and join our great community. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. It's been a real pleasure. This is Mike from Drone Supremacy. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao.